Hello. It's my pleasure to welcome our audience and speakers today to the Alumni Speaker Series session. As you know, today's session is being recorded and it will be available on YouTube for viewing. A link to the recording will be sent out after the session in the coming days. And we ask you to please submit your questions in the Q&A section, and we will try and answer as many of them as possible as the event progresses. So before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to take a moment to publicly acknowledge the traditional territory upon which we live and work as an important step towards reconciliation. The University of Waterloo acknowledges that much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. Our campus is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land granted to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is centralized within the Office of Indigenous Relations. As we are likely calling in from different locations across Canada and the world, I would also like to acknowledge the Indigenous communities globally that have lived and continue to live in harmony with nature. I wish to recognize the innovations that came before us and appreciate the sustainable principles that Indigenous communities continue to live by. So before I introduce our esteemed experts on the panel today, I'll briefly introduce myself. I am a professor and Associate Director of Graduate Studies at the School of Architecture here at the University of Waterloo. My research and teaching operate at the intersection of architecture, landscape, and urbanism. And for the past 15 years, I've been pursuing research and design work on the role of architecture and infrastructure in rural and remote regions and examining the wider context and climate of architecture that architecture is situated in, including social, ecological, and political forces that shape it. So I'm honored to be the moderator for today's alumni speaker session, hosting panelists from a wide range of backgrounds, but each having a unique mission in addressing housing challenges that many cities face today. Our panel will dissect the role that architects and planners play as public leaders, as visionaries, and as political influencers as we address the right to housing as a fundamental human right, essential to the inherent dignity and well-being of people, and crucial to building a sustainable and inclusive communities. Our panelists will provoke your thoughts with ideas not of incremental change, but of broad transformational ideas that are needed if we are really to take on the housing crisis head on. And so I am absolutely certain that it will be an engaging and educational and thought-provoking discussion. So we have 3 panelists here that I'm delighted to welcome. Neeraj Bhatia is Associate Professor at the California College of Art in San Francisco and Principal of the design practice, The Open Workshop. His current work resides at the intersection of politics, equity, and the commons as it relates to urbanism and housing. Adrian Blackwell is Associate Professor at the School of Architecture at the University of Waterloo. He is an artist and urban and architectural designer whose work examines the relation between physical spaces and political and economic forces. Adrian writes regularly about the intersections of art, architecture, urbanism, and his current research focuses on architecture's political potential, on urbanization in contemporary China, on the disappearance of public housing in North America, and on the constitutive paradoxes of public space. And lastly, Liana Bresler is a principal at SVN Architects and Planners, an interdisciplinary design firm of 120 architects, landscape architects, planners, and urban designers, where she works on a wide range of projects, including both market and public sector housing. Liana is currently co-leading the integrated transit-oriented development team on the Ontario line as the technical advisor to Metrolinx and to Infrastructure Ontario, as well as being principal in charge for the ongoing retrofit of Toronto Community Housing in Scarborough, and an innovative rental housing project on the edge of Leslieville for a task design build. So to see the full biographies of the speakers, you can see the event page, and I think we're putting a link in the chat. So thank you all for being here. And maybe to sort of start the conversation, we need to kind of lay the groundwork for understanding the current state of housing in many of our cities and the challenges that architects, political leaders, and urban planners are facing today. We need to know the current conditions so that we can identify directions of where to go from here. And as we often tell our students, we need to spend more time defining the problems before we can identify innovative and creative solutions to address these problems. So part of today's discussion is about identifying these problems. And I thought that, perhaps the first question is to unpack what we mean by a Canadian's right to housing. As we were discussing this title, a key question sort of quickly emerged of what do we mean by a Canadian's right to housing? Because of course, housing challenges in cities like Toronto or Vancouver are very different from ones in Northern Ontario or in Nunavut or other Indigenous communities, and are equally different, for instance, from mid-sized cities. And so it begs the question, can we speak holistically to this question of can we speak holistically to the question of housing challenges, or do we need to think about calibrated solutions to different regions that have very different challenges? And so, because of the diverse experiences of our speakers, another question is how much are the challenges facing Canada, shared in the United States? How, to what degree are they really North American problems? Or even, shared in other countries. And I suspect that one thing that will emerge is the critical role that housing policy plays, and sometimes the lack of policy, and that is very different in different municipalities in different regions of the country, and certainly from country to country. So, one sort of last thought before I turn to questions is, when you look up something like the United Nations right to housing, some of the key things they identify is the right to choose, the freedom of movement in choosing that sort of housing, security of tenure, equal access without discrimination, the right to participate in housing-related decisions at both the national and community level, which I think is really important. And perhaps most important in some ways as designers is the idea, which isn't in the United Nations document, but is this idea of having agency, agency perhaps in design, in the ability to adapt one's housing, in thinking about the programming of community housing, et cetera. So I hope these are some of the questions that we address directly and indirectly today. So the first question, and I'll start with Adrian, is, based on your academic perspective, what do you think fair access to housing looks like in some of these different contexts?
Thanks, Lola, and the organizers for inviting me. This is a difficult lot of aspects to this first question. I think fair access to housing is a big challenge in Canada and in North America more generally, because the housing system is riddled with systemic biases. The housing system we currently have is focused on incentivizing the ownership of housing for nuclear single families. The CMHC, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, was started after the Second World War specifically to incentivize home ownership and suburban development as a strategy to solve the crisis of housing at that time. And it privileged that form of housing over a whole set of other possible forms of housing, which include rental, cooperative, co-ownership, et cetera. In the 1990s, the federal and provincial governments cut funding to other forms of housing and focused exclusively on home ownership. And so we have this very singular focus in terms of housing affordability. And it's a structure that heavily privileges people with inherited wealth, allowing people, first-time buyers, to place down payments on property by using inherited wealth. And this creates a feedback loop that deepens inequality. Indigenous people who live on reserve can't own property and therefore are not able to build equity in their homes, Black families have much lower intergenerational wealth transfer than white families, and as a result are deeply disadvantaged in an equity-based housing system. So as a result, housing inequality is tightly tied to racial inequality in Canada. One solution to this problem would be to increase access to home ownership. And that's what the CMHC has been trying for a long time, and it hasn't really solved the problem. We've seen this in the United States as well, but essentially lower income families, people who have less existing wealth, pay more for their mortgages and therefore pay more for their housing. So specifically, we charge those people that are most vulnerable in society more for housing than everybody else. And that's not a way to create a fair housing system. So I think the real solution to create an affordable housing market would be to cool the market and increase funding for decommodified forms of housing.
Thank you, Adrian. Liana, you're coming from the private sector, but also with a lot of experience in public housing and affordable housing work in Canada. What do you see as, what do you think fair access to housing looks like in some of these different contexts?
Thanks, Lola. Yeah, I think the issues we're facing in Canada are very much global and common, but there are unique pressures here. I agree with Adrian. This particular history that we've had in Canada is one kind of contributor to the issue of the commodification of housing, which is I think maybe one of our two biggest challenges. The other being just the population growth and the concentration of it in cities and what that does and how that then plays into the commodification of housing. So I think, supply is not the only issue, but there is a shortage of supply, and there is huge pressures, that we're seeing kind of, 10, 20 years down the line, because we can project the population growth and we're not able to meet it. So I think it's the combination of those two pieces. And I think in a free market, I think the kind of fair access to housing, maybe a way of think about it is just having options and not being kind of locked into, the one kind of solutions that offers to you. And I think that plays across kind of different segments of the population, from, the unhoused to kind of lower income or middle class, or you feel like you're kind of trapped in whatever scenario that is. Adrian spoke about, the privileging of ownership, and I think for those people and families in our communities that are kind of feel like they are renting, they're maybe wishing to move into ownership, but they're exposed and vulnerable in other ways because there are issues around kind of housing rental and protection of tenants. That's still an ongoing issue, even though I think governments have tried to address it. So again, I think it's addressing the issue of supply. I think the fairness in the Canadian context is allowing people to have the options, and then really in that way address the human right aspect of being able to live in dignity and security.
Thank you. I mean, one observation, I'm going to turn to Neeraj, but it's interesting how, and I'm adding this now because maybe Neeraj can also speak to this, but for any of you, is, it feels like we've been very risk averse to try new approaches, or we quickly discontinue approaches. I'm thinking of in Northern Canada, there was interesting experiments in rent to own that, from my understanding, traveling to the north, were quite successful, but they get discontinued, and rather than try, for whatever reason, rather than trying to adapt, simply, and so we are left with very few options of how to access housing. But Neeraj, based on your work and research in California, and specifically San Francisco and the Bay Area, which is, you know, as you pointed out, perhaps way ahead of us in all the challenges that cities like Toronto and Vancouver are facing. What does unfair access to housing look like in some of these contexts?
Yeah, thank you, Lola, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. It's really great to be in conversation with all of you and hear about the issues that you're facing in Ontario and in Canada. In San Francisco, you know, we're in one of the richest cities in the world, and there's so much capital aggregation here, yet we have such a large unhoused population. So I think there's something kind of glaring about some of the issues in advanced capitalism that, you know, wealth aggregation isn't solving this problem right now. And one of the things we see in our context here is that there's people that own property and bought property, you know, maybe in the 60s, 70s, 80s at a very low price. And there's people that are locked into rent control. And so if you add up those two groups, it's about 75 to 80% of the population in the city. And many of these people are not inclined to support new housing. You know, there's often conversations about changing the character of the neighborhood and so forth. And so there's actually a very small group that want new housing. The way that we're dealing with housing here isn't through the state providing affordable housing as it used to be in America. It's much more based on a percentage of new developments that need to be affordable. But that percentage is quite low. And in fact, it reaffirms this, you know, problematic system of commodifying housing. So it's really a Band-Aid, you know, solution in the end. And the percentage of affordable is based on the AMI of an area. So the kind of median income of an area. And you can imagine the median income in most of San Francisco is, you know, you could qualify if you made as a household like 100,000, 120,000. It's not a low, you know, threshold for most people, you know, would qualify. So there's a huge wait list for this. And I think what Adrian said about, you know, questions of access to financing and policy that has kind of systemic biases in it promotes this idea of legacy wealth. So it kind of reaffirms this system. And I think one of the largest issues more generally is that housing is no longer something that people are buying to live in as it might have been 50 years ago. Housing is much more of a speculative wealth aggregator for those that have access to capital. And that's, so it's just a problematic relationship we've developed to the idea of housing and to land. And I think that's a very different problem than we had, you know, 50 years ago, because people would buy a house and live in it their whole lives and often pass it down, you know, internally in their family. And now we have people buying multiple properties and not living in them and, you know, renting them and so forth. And I remember being on a panel with Carol Galante, who was the former federal housing commissioner for HUD when Obama was the president here, and kind of posing this question to her about, you know, maybe we need to redefine our relationship to speculative aggregation of wealth, or the idea that wealth accumulation is kind of tied to housing. And she had a really interesting answer of saying, you know, if you look at the policy in America, so much wealth aggregation was made by those that were middle and upper class and those that were primarily white, and that only now are we seeing more ability for minorities to play the game, so to speak, that others have had an ability to play for several years. And now to change the rules of the game or to stop the game also poses its own question about fairness to this, you know, because statistically, at least in America, wealth aggregation generationally has been quickest through the ownership of property. So, you know, like careers, education, all of these things obviously play a role, but those that have been able to afford property have been able to increase within one generation more than anything else. And so I think we've kind of developed this very problematic system, but backtracking on this system also has some issues as well, because some people have actually really used the system and developed a lot of wealth from it. And those that are just now getting into the game of being able to have maybe, I wouldn't say a fair, but a slightly more fair access to the system, you know, would also, you know, cancel their chances out. And so in the Bay Area, you know, what if you asked a developer what, you know, your question, what fair access looks like, they would say micro units, you know, that we just got to produce density. And these are, you know, usually 200 square foot units. that really try to retain, the idea of a 1-bedroom unit, but really reducing it to its minimum. So it's very small bathroom, very, very small dining area, almost a dysfunctional kitchen. And that's really seen as, fair access, that these units come down because their square foot allocations are very low. And I think as a society, we just have to ask ourselves, are these humane and ethical living conditions? And what are the larger kind of things that come or result from holding on to the idea of a private unit or a private territory for an individual or for a small group?
Thank you. Thank you all. There's one question that came in from Neeraj Umar, which touches very much actually, Neeraj, on what you were just talking about. It says, even for immigrants, it's very difficult to access housing. My family has been in government housing for 20 years because they are too afraid to go into debt to buy a house for a family of 6. Is there support for immigrants in navigating these difficult and very different life changes and challenges? I don't know if open to anyone.
Yeah, I can just speak on the local context of where I am in the Bay Area. I wouldn't say there's additional support for immigrants. The wait lists are extremely long for affordable housing. And one of the issues is that a lot of people don't want to get into affordable housing because there's rules about how much you can sell it for, once you leave. And so they don't see that as, again, getting into the game as a form of wealth aggregation. So it provides shelter, but again, this is kind of the issue of like seeing housing as shelter and housing as wealth aggregation. I think because we kind of see it much more as wealth aggregation as a society, many people are saying, why even do that? Because I'm just going to be, paying off a mortgage for something that I can't flip for more money in 10 or 15 years when I move out.
Liana or Adrian, do you, we don't, only if you have additional thoughts in the Canadian context.
I'm not aware of any policies that would help immigrants get into the housing market.
That's, sadly my sense as well. Okay, we might come back to this sort of question indirectly. The next question sort of goes to sort of how we might understand the sort of components of housing, that there's the sort of physical component, a social component, and a financial and public policy component. And so as we sort of set the scene for this question of, or not question, but for the reality that we have a housing crisis, there are these 3 components: the physical form, which in some ways is the design or the different typologies of housing that we have. There's a social dimension, which inflects who we think we are designing for. Is it, as Adrian mentioned, the kind of nuclear family? Are we acknowledging the multi-generational families, the single person households, younger people coming into the market, and how these sort of different perspectives bias the delivery of housing types? And then the third component is the sort of financing protocols and public policy. And so I'm hoping that each of you could speak to some of these different dimensions and what you see as the agency that designers might have in relation to these sort of 3 components. So Liana, maybe we can start with you.
Sure, maybe I'll start at the end there with the policy, because I do think the fundamental shifts kind of exist in that realm. And as designers, we don't maybe operate directly in those spheres, but we certainly can be involved in the public discourse and affect it. And I think in the local context that certainly exists and has kind of moved the conversation. The dial kind of shifts a little bit every few years. I also think it's important to recognize there are designers and architects like working in government and actually working on policies, and so they're kind of part of our professional community and have the kind of power to affect change. So I think that's one important avenue. And then again, on the policy side, what designers can do is actually challenge things through design. And there could be, more kind of limited, straightforward things like even changes to the Ontario Building Code. So there's a conversation. Actually, I recently signed a letter from a graduate of the University of Waterloo that's advocating for the single egress in 4-story building. So that's a small thing, maybe in the kind of bigger picture we're talking about, but enabling, you know, a single egress in low-rise building means that it lowers the cost of construction. It makes this kind of form of housing of low rises kind of more viable. It means that, you know, we can see that maybe proliferating kind of within neighborhoods. So there are kind of multiple impacts that changes like that could bring. So that's kind of on the policy side. And the physical form of housing, I think, you know, it's maybe not directly to the question of affordability, but if we're thinking about families living in cities and the necessity to live in multi-housing, just, you know, by just pure numbers game and the land that's available, and the mindset that maybe people have of what they would want to see in a single family house. So I think there's a role for the designer to challenge what the typical design of multi-housing looks like. And again, a lot of it is coming down from policy, from the developer. There are kind of external pressures that are about the system, but there are ways to challenge that. And an example of something that we're working on now is just looking at, you know, promoting something maybe as simple as just cross ventilation in units. So you live in an apartment building, but you are not forced to live in your typical, you know, deep apartment with a like shallow deep apartment with limited light, limited air circulation. So there are ways through kind of design, innovation, creativity, pushing and pulling a little bit, the zoning, getting things through approval, working with developers to kind of make sure the financial performer kind of still works, but trying to bring this little bit of innovation that, you know, will make living in multi-unit housing more fair, I guess, if we go back to the previous question. So there are changes there, I guess, formal changes like that are, I think designers can continue to push on, and they are, and I think we need to kind of continue. There's a lot here, but I guess there's maybe if we speak about the social aspect, there's a kind of a whole conversation we could have about kind of community engagement and the responsibility of the designer to do that. I think that's depending on the kind of form of housing you're working on. It takes on different forms. So for example, when we work on market housing, the type of community engagement you would have is really often more conversation about NIMBYism and how the overall mass or height of the building fits within the neighborhood. And so that's one kind of community engagement. I think more meaningful community engagements we've had is more on the affordable housing sphere, where you actually have some knowledge of the end user, or you're working within a community that's kind of known, even if they're not like specifically the individual end user. And so I think really having kind of meaningful engagement and working with the community to understand the particular needs, and it's the units, but it's also the public amenities. It's the way, you know, other amenities that need to come with the housing to support the community, understanding access to transit and things like that need to be kind of promoted alongside the housing. So I think that's another area where designers could contribute.
Thank you so much. Neeraj.
It's a great question, actually. I was just thinking about, you know, I used to live in Houston, and there's no zoning in Houston, and you don't see too many towers in Houston, but when you do, because there's no zoning, it's often a direct, say, reification of land value that, you know, to build vertically, the land has to have more value. And I think we see that as well in New York. Like if you think about the pencil towers that we've seen the last few years, that's not a super unique typology by any means, but it was a typology that was more or less unleashed when land hit a particular value. And so this idea between land value and form is, I think, like very, very intimate when we speak about housing. And I think, and this, you kind of mentioned this earlier, Lola, that capital is very risk adverse and developers are very risk adverse. So there tends to be a sameness that's produced through capitalism, right? A repetition of things. And I think repetition scares a lot of people because I think when people see repetitive housing, they have ideas. They might think that that idea of repetitive housing somehow produces repetitive people or kind of a repetitive social sphere, which isn't true. We know that from the fact that we all have the exact same phone and other computers and things like this. That none of this, but there's obviously capital has found that repetition can make things cheaper, and strangely, architects have not really embrace the repetitiveness. I think a lot of architects still see their role in multi-unit housing as trying to deny the repetitiveness, of trying to cover up the repetitiveness, whether this is trying to make big buildings look small by using kind of, dancing punched windows or forms that are and materials to try to break them down. I think there's a real project in architecture to cover this up implicitly. I don't even think we talk about it. I think it's like really somehow deeply embedded that these are, kind of societal issues that we must, cover up. And I think the real role of architecture is to make these issues legible, to kind of situate the discourse as architecture as something that kind of can provide an awareness to these larger issues around capital. I think maybe where the agency of the architect is beyond legibility is to think through typology and think through the idea of housing as a framework that can be adjusted in time. There's so many things we can't anticipate. So if I think about like towers, multi-unit towers or condo design in Toronto or even here in the Bay, like concrete shear walls, right, is a very key thing that are used to divide units and provide the shear walls you need, but it also makes it a lot harder to reconfigure units in time. And so how do we actually think through how ideas of families and social units are changing, and yet these typologies may not be allowing as much flexibility and time as we need. I think one of the bigger issues in the social realm is that a lot of housing is really still geared at the nuclear family, or at least here in the Bay, young professionals, like what we call precarious workers. These are kind of transient workers that come in, work for a series of years and leave. And so you have these kind of two demographic groups that so much of housing is aimed at, and everyone else is not acknowledged. And there's actually so many people living in alternative configurations of families and find meaningful social units of support and care that are just not acknowledged by the system of development. So again, we see these kind of biases about what a family is and what's kind of implicitly promoted through this idea of kind of our social units. I'm not a planner by any means, but I definitely agree with Liana that policy plays a huge role in this. Policy is something that historically has had kind of racism embedded in it in housing. But I think policy can also be something that helps change the conversation. So I've been working a lot with the San Francisco Planning Department here. And one of the things the planning department sees as a value of working with architects is beta testing policies. So kind of running through scenarios of policy and asking us to visualize what that would mean. And I always feel like we need some kind of developer on our team to really find all the loopholes of, how they can maybe, there's always loopholes, I imagine, that's, someone can find to exploit these systems. But I think the ability to visualize policy is huge, because I think policy is written in a language that the public can't comprehend. And in fact, even, as architects, it's very difficult sometimes to comprehend what the implications of certain policies are, even well-intentioned policies might be. And we've kind of been working in a reverse way of, both looking at policies that are being proposed and trying to visualize them, but also proposing policy for the planning department through research on housing and then visualizing it preemptively. And so we just actually proposed a policy around group housing, which is sort of a form of co-living here in the Bay, because we were seeing that, developers were essentially calling projects group housing that were more or less private units with very little shared amenities. And so the policy that we're enacting will actually produce much more shared space and a higher quality of shared amenities for people. And there's a lot of developers right now that are trying to fight this policy, of course, because it changes their profitability margin, let's say. But I think these are things that, the system reacts. Like capitalism's like water, it flows where you let it flow. And if you set up a barrier, it'll try to flow around, but it finds a new way, but it reacts. And I think policy is something that we need to be much more proactive at understanding. And something that, I do with students is we like look at, even before we design housing, so much of like housing studios in America are based on like, what does it look like? I think like the whole way we talk about projects, at the end of a semester is extremely problematic. Still, like the number of times like this is a beautiful project or a beautiful drawing is like the key crit takeaway of a good, valuable project. We actually don't start with the design of housing. We start looking at questions of protocols of the land, protocols, all the kind of invisible protocols. We meet with communities and talk to people living in alternative family configurations, and just try to kind of get a sense of that relationship of the invisible things that we don't often talk about as architects, and how they interact with and sometimes translate into form, and how there's kind of levers on both sides of this equation through form as well as through these protocols themselves.
Thank you. I'll get Adrian to respond, and then there's actually a couple of questions that sort of pick up on some of these points that you've both made. But Adrian, go ahead.
Thanks, Liana and Neeraj. These are great points. I think I wanted to start, this is a complicated question to talk about these different levels, and I'm going to talk about 3 different levels that hopefully overlap with the 3 that have been proposed. I really like this concept that David Madden and Peter Marcuse developed in their book In Defense of Housing, of residential alienation. They say, people are alienated from their housing by being underhoused, by paying too much, by being locked into mortgages that forfeit other options in their lives. At the most extreme case, by homelessness. And these kinds of forms of alienation are tied to the exchangeability of housing. So the word alienation, of course, means to exchange. And so they think, as Neeraj has already pointed out, the turning of housing into an asset rather than a place to live is something which is accelerating in the present, but is really very closely tied to the problem of land as exchangeable. And we often think of land, the exchangeability of land, as a kind of transhistorical fact, like the Romans had property rights which resembled ours. So there's nothing historically specific about those rights, but I think in fact there is, and they re-emerged in a very specific form with the birth of capitalism. And I've been working with David Fortin, who's at Laurentian University, on an editorial project, an issue of the journal Scapegoat, Architecture, Landscape, Political Economy, called Canada Delineating Nation-State Capitalism, in which we think about the relationship between urban form and Indigenous land dispossession, and the kinds of continuities, the deep continuities between the pathologies of the contemporary city and the violence of settler colonialism. So part of what we argue in our editorial, and we're basing this on the work of people like Brenna Bandar and Alan Greer, who have recently written interesting books about property and colonialism, is that modern property was formed not in Europe, as it's often described, but in North America, in the contact between Indigenous people and settlers. New forms of property were developed in this context, and the modern concept of its exchangeability, the idea that land, which is absolutely fixed in place, can be circulated and exchanged, kind of emerged at that time. And so alienation, I think, also derives in that time. Marx called that moment in history the period of so-called primitive accumulation. A moment in which people, Indigenous people in North America and peasants in Europe were pulled from their land and thereby alienated from a set of things. They were alienated from their own creativity, the products of their own labor. They were alienated from the kinship and and communities in which they were living. And they were alienated from the ecological milieu that they inhabited. And I think for a designer, it's interesting to think about these three forms of alienation because I think they persist in the present. That is, people in their housing alienation are deeply alienated from the ecological milieu they inhabit, from the social milieus around them, and from their own creativity and autonomy around housing. I mean, people may feel like they have agency over the housing they own, but that's only minimally the case in a lot of condominium housing. And certainly for people who don't own their housing, they don't feel that way. So I think for architects, it's interesting to think about how they can advocate for policies and for design that intensifies the connections that these alienations refuse or break. So how can we be better connected to our ecological milieu? And I think architects like Louf in Montreal are really doing interesting work around ecosystemic urbanism and thinking about how housing can be connected to its ecological milieu in terms of, you know, the way materials flow through the building, but also the way you access, how inhabitants of the building access the exterior world and the climate that surrounds the building and the environments that surround the building. I think, you know, architects historically like Diamond Schmidt, Olsen Warland in Toronto thought a lot about the social milieu of housing through different cooperatives that they designed. And I think the collective forms of Levitt Goodman's work are really interested in the question of the social milieu of housing. And I think in terms of creativity and autonomy, it's interesting to think about how something as simple as Lacaton and Vasal's addition to an apartment building opens up a space of creativity and potential in housing. And I think the work of John Van Nostrand and Parcel Developments and SVN have been doing interesting work kind of at the margins of the practice in evolutionary housing through projects like the Pro Home or James Street North. These are kinds of unbuilt experiments that think about how housing can change in time according to the needs of the inhabitants. So I think this question of how creativity, the social milieu and the ecological milieu can all be reconnected in their current, from the position of their current alienation is a framework that architects can think through to rethink the design of housing.
Thank you very much. We have 2 or 3 questions, so I'll ask the first couple. The first one is, how much do you think that large investors like Blackstone are the cause of price increase? And do you think it is the role of government to find a solution to prevent them from investment, or at least to kind of limit this kind of investment in housing that perhaps creates distortions?
I mean, I think this is a really great point. I mean, in terms of the financialization of housing, the financialization of rental housing is a relatively new and emerging phenomena. And a lot of the financialization is actually in the hands of pension funds. And it's interesting that one way to think about this is, why can't public sector pension funds be more progressive in their investments? You know, like there's a movement to, you know, divest from oil in many different sectors. But what about divesting from predatory landlordism? That would be another thing that unions and public sector unions could be more involved in. But I think in terms of government, I mean, what government should be doing is preventing the actions that these investors take to increase their incomes, which have to do with above guideline rent increases and rent evictions. So their interest is to increase the rent, and they need to either kick the person out of the unit through a rent eviction process, or they need to make some minimal renovation by which they can then increase the rent by enough that somebody is likely to leave or suffers under a much heavier rent burden. So I think it's legislation that could actually better prevent those actions on the parts of the investors, which would help to make the investment slightly less desirable for the investment companies, but more importantly, protect the tenants.
Thank you. This is a question to anyone. I've been living in Denmark for the past 5 years. So my first thought is Canada is probably very far behind on Denmark. And the question is, where there are many co-housing projects with many new builds in the last few years, rental, cooperative, and market-based home ownership types. These developments have been established since the late 70s and are not considered experimental or new forms of housing. Can you explain, I mean, open to anyone, why this housing type has not gained a foothold in a substantial foothold in Canada, especially in the rural north? Although not always inexpensive to build, there are strong social supports and shared resources such as common spaces that support long-term housing viability and sustainability. Anyone want to?
Lola, I think you're probably best to answer that question.
I mean, in the north, there is one cooperative housing actually in Iqaluit, which I gather has been very successful. And so I've been asking myself the same question: why has that not been repeated? My only answer is that it goes back to this sort of risk aversion, not just of developers and banks, but I think governments have become very risk averse, and are in the north. There's questions of sort of how mortgages work, which has made this also complexifies things. But I mean, perhaps more broadly to any of you, I mean, even in the context of Toronto there, or San Francisco, why are we not seeing more examples of co-housing models? I mean, maybe Neeraj, you want to take this on, since this is deeply embedded in your research.
Yeah, sure. I think it's funny, in the Bay Area, we are seeing a lot more co-housing projects. And I think the reason for that is you can pack a lot more people into a building and sell it. And there's density bonuses that are given for co-housing projects. One of the reasons for the legislation we just put forward. So we are seeing them come online. I don't think they would be resembling some of the co-housing or cooperatives that are being discussed in Denmark. I think, and it's interesting to see the branding around these new projects. They really dissociate themselves from, say, the first generation of co-living in the Bay Area, which were the communes in the 1960s, which, at that time in the late 1960s and early 70s, you had 1 million people in America living in forms of communes, and many of them were in the Bay Area and Northern California. And at that time, we had two typologies. There was communes that set up in the hinterland and really tried to leave the city and set up, say, an alternative way of living outside the system, if that's possible to be outside the system. But that was, the idea was that, oftentimes even trying to be closed societies, growing their own food, producing their own energy and so forth. And then you had also communes in the city, and those communes often reappropriated buildings, like strangely, actually, a lot of Victorian and Edwardian, mansions meant for bourgeois families in the Bay Area were turned into these communes, warehouses. And even today, where we have just as many communes, intentional communities in San Francisco, often through necessity today, they're often hidden, that when you're walking through the city, you don't see these radical experiments that are happening. And sometimes they're not as radical, but sometimes they are incredibly radical in terms of thinking about alternative family units, thinking about new forms of sharing resources, and so forth. I think one of the issues that in the Bay Area I've seen is that many of the intentional communities wanted to develop on their own, but access to capital is really tricky when you're not a family, like meaning through blood relations. And so this is actually, say, the next thing that we're trying to push in our legislative push, is to redefine what a family means in the Bay Area, to actually open up questions of capital access. And one of our examples is the Baugruppen projects in Germany, which are essentially community groups coming together with a designer, often without a developer, and developing directly, so cutting out the developer out of the equation. And because this is a recognized system by the German government and banks, there's very easy access to capital. So you realize that's actually one of the biggest hindrances for, say, communities in a grassroots way to start these projects. One of the things that I will say about some of the new co-living projects we're seeing here in the Bay Area is that unlike the communes of the 1960s, all of the shared governance and labor is taken away. And so it's outsourced. So whether this is like buying groceries or cleaning, even questions about how to, what are the commons, how to maintain, steward them, and so forth. There's often community managers that are put in place and companies that are hired to do a lot of the labor and work. And I think a lot of the developers that are doing these projects see that as the failure of the first generation, say co-living and commune projects, was that the labor was, and the questions of governance caused frictions that eventually caused these communities to fall. And actually in our research, it's a really tricky point, because I think for any of us that have had roommates, it is tricky to live with people. It could be the smallest thing, not like a strong political discourse that's the fall of the public realm. It could be who didn't do the dishes or who didn't clean out their hair from the bathtub or something like this. And so there is kind of a patience and sacrifice that is inherent in living with other people and sharing resources that maybe needs to be relearned by all of us a little bit more. But for us, actually, it's the kind of labor and the governance capacity of co-living that is the true agency of these types of projects, that people can define more clearly what type of way of living they want. And I think most architects can relate to this, that some of your maybe biggest fights in architecture school were with people you worked with on projects, but also maybe some of your deepest friendships and bonds are with those same people. And so there's a kind of two sides of this coin to labor, that, laboring with people is difficult, but it also produces community in the end. And this is something we're not seeing in the new co-living projects where everything's outsourced to companies, is that community is really a struggling thing. So these community managers are hired to then create community. Whereas, in the end, community is formed by people working together on shared kind of collective goals.
Thank you.
I wanted to add one thing.
Sure, go ahead.
Just to the question. I mean, I think I really appreciate everything Neeraj has said, but just to go back to the Denmark, North America question. And I think that the frontier mentality, the sort of settler colonial frontier mentality in North America and Canada is really key to the types of legislations and policies that make that type of housing difficult. We just live in a place that is blind to the violence of its own making. And so I think in a way, like questions of reconciliation and addressing Indigenous rights to land in North America are going to naturally call into question the forms of housing that we have. And we're going to have to really rethink the way we organize housing in terms of this isolated frontier settler colonial mentality. But at the moment, we are still under its spell. And that's one of the reasons we can't make these forms of housing here as easily.
And I think, super quickly, that I want to try and sneak in our last question, but I think questions of collectivity, both in the public realm, in housing, in a number of, in social policy, are for the most part stronger and more developed in Europe. And I think part of the reason they are perhaps not in North America is precisely this sort of settler mentality of like, you go it on your own, you own your own property. I mean, these are inherent in how North America was founded. And so we may, anyways, it's a fascinating kind of question. So maybe I'll try and combine the last two questions just in the interest of time, which is, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges in how we're currently thinking about the provision of housing? And what are some of the kind of untapped opportunities that, leadership, whether it's architects, designers, planners, politicians, should be thinking about? So kind of two sides maybe of the same question. Liana, maybe I'll start with you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think there are kind of the two major pieces that we've been discussing here are the first is how do we curb in some way the commodification of housing in our context. I think it requires a kind of a look at things that are very fundamental to like who we are, and how people kind of build their life, their equity, how, process of immigration and kind of becoming established, like all those things are kind of tied up with that. And like Neeraj spoke to that a little bit, like how fundamental that is to how people, anyway, I guess, behave in the economy. I think I'm not an economist, but I think there are things that are kind of unique in our context that really, really privilege that kind of investment, and we'll need to look at the policies that promote that, including like taxation and things that I think will be very hard for people to kind of make that shift, but we need to look there and kind of start that conversation. And then on the other side, on the supply and the kind of the access to housing in that perspective, I think we really need to kind of blow open our thoughts about zoning and how we build in cities. And there's so many kind of components to that, but I think it's, if you look at, the patterns of density, and I feel like we've been talking about this for years, but there's still, swaths of neighborhoods, so-called stable neighborhoods, density that's still being proposed along kind of major avenues and arteries, and not a lot in between. And we're starting to see some movement on legislation to kind of allow for this this missing middle, but there's kind of a whole spectrum of work that needs to be done in that area. I think maybe I'll speak to something that we in our practice we look at kind of specifically as maybe less kind of tapped into area is the infrastructure, and how there's kind of two sides to that. So if we think about infrastructure, and maybe particularly transit, there are impacts of thinking about infrastructure as this kind of back of house of our cities and what it means to live near it and the kind of communities that develop around it. And so I think acting on kind of on both sides of this kind of thinking ahead on our transit planning and how we build it anew in the cities, and also how we address existing facilities is how can we build this infrastructure in a way that doesn't sterilize entire neighborhoods, that promotes kind of communities around it, that actually offers that access to transit to the same community. So we kind of with the same move try and increase the housing supply, create kind of better communities in areas where we've typically kind of shun them to kind of, oh, this is the the maintenance facility for so and so, but and really open up kind of new opportunities by rethinking those parts of the cities that we've neglected. And we often see kind of public housing surround these kind of communities. So yeah, I think it's those two things. It's the zoning and rethinking the commodification. I think it's probably easier to act on the latter, and that's kind of right in front of us.
Thank you. I'm gonna get, even though these are like impossibly vast questions, I'm gonna ask Neeraj and Adrian to kind of answer in like 2-3 minutes, just because I want to also leave time. There are a couple of good questions that we haven't been able to answer yet. So Neeraj, go ahead.
Sure. So I know in like 2014, the chief financial officer of San Francisco was asked, how many units would you need to change the price of housing? And at that time, it was like 150,000 units would need to be dropped into San Francisco overnight for, say, any normal person to feel a change in their rent burden or purchasing power. And I think that number is closer to 200,000 now. And that would really equate to the amount of housing that we built in the last 100 years in San Francisco. So I think the way that we develop needs to change. I think we need to actually kind of see housing as something that needs to be, say, more mass produced in certain ways. But I don't think supply side will just cover this all on its own. There's two kind of interesting things being done in California right now. One is we've gotten rid of all single family zoning in the state. So all single family zoned properties can actually add up to 2 ADUs on their parcels. And the second one, and this is still in an early stage, there's a task force put together to look at reparations of land, for red line neighborhoods, indigenous communities, and so forth. So I think these are kind of two exciting kind of developments that could actually start, say, changing the conversation of our relationship to land and housing.
Thank you. Adrian.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I think the answers that you just gave, Neeraj, are really interesting, and Liana, yours as well. I'm very interested in an argument that's emerged over the last couple of years around the abolition of property. So people like Ronaldo Walcott in Toronto in his book on property, and in California, UCLA, Ananya Roy has been talking about the way in which movements to abolish prisons and police require also the abolition of property, because essentially these tools like prisons and police exist to support the unequal distribution of property in society. And so, I mean, what that means is not clear. Neither, I think, Ronaldo Walcott nor Ananya Roy are suggesting that people shouldn't have great housing, that's for sure, but under different terms. So I think that's something that, like the abolition of prisons and police, requires a lot of imagination in how we can care for each other differently. I think one policy that I've been very interested in with a group of artists is a gentrification tax. A group of artists called Gentrification Tax Action have been advocating for a gentrification tax, something that would be a hypothecated tax. A hypothecated tax means a tax that's focused to fund something very specific. So a gentrification tax would tax the profits of land speculation. So it's like a capital gains tax. But it would be focused on the production of publicly funded, locally managed, deeply affordable housing. So in the areas in which it's raised. And so it's meant to address one of the problems that land trusts try to address, which is the capture and extraction of the social increment of wealth. That is an idea that since Henry George in the 19th century has been understood that when land increases when the value of land increases in a given neighborhood, it's not a result of the individual owner's work. It's a result of the community. And so when an individual owner takes that value away from the community, they're extracting something that they'd never earned, which is why Henry George called it the unearned increment. And so gentrification tax and the land trust are two interesting mechanisms, I think, for addressing this unearned speculative wealth. And so I think that's one of the things that we need to think about. How can we develop systems to take away this speculative value from individual owners and create public goods like housing with it?
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to a couple of the questions that have been cropping up before we wrap up. One is, so thank you for the discussion. Can you comment on what you mean by right? Should the right to housing be a strong and fundamental right that government should commit to providing, whether by market or non-market means, or should it be a weak right that government should support but not privilege over other priorities?
I mean, I would jump in just to say, I think it should be a strong right. I mean, I think people need a place to live, and I think they should have a generous place to live. They need a beautiful place to live in which they can thrive. And so that should be a right, yes.
Does anyone disagree?
Maybe just to build on that, I think, I think it's got, shelter is a, fundamental right. And I think one of the issues of not having this as a right is that you can't expect people to be political if they just don't have basic necessity covered, And so I think this is one of the issues we see in America right now, is that so much of the country is living in poverty, and that goes beyond housing, access to education, and many other, say, social services. And then they're being asked to kind of take political stances for which they can't make long-term decisions or informed decisions about, and you can kind of very easily see the ramifications of that in our context here, which I don't think Canada's too far behind in, where politics is going as well. So I think this as a right actually shifts the conversation of people having, say, more privilege to be more politically inclined to look at kind of collective endeavors more holistically.
Thank you.
I'll add maybe just that I do think it's difficult to answer as like kind of a black and white statement. Like even if you look at the Canadian legislation that guarantees it, it means that government has needs to have a commitment to kind of promote it, but there's no like individual guarantee of this right. So it's I think even legally hard to understand, like what does that really mean? At least for me as like a lay person in the legal sense. But I think what we've been discussing here today is that we have to look at the increment in which government, I guess, intervenes in some of those things and dial it up, I guess, to put it simply. It's not we can't leave the open market to solve this, which means that there are going to have to be other rights that are involved in this discussion. And I think this is why we need the discourse to kind of talk about what that means and what we're willing to do collectively.
Let me just, maybe I'll ask one last question. And I think this to some degree builds on something you were talking about, Liana. Art says draconian zoning laws in North America make building new housing supply difficult. Do you think there will be a change in zoning law amendment to increase density, such as in Toronto or San Francisco or LA? What are some potential new construction techniques to reduce the cost of construction and allow more affordable homes? Current techniques include the 5/1 or precast panels, etc.
I'll answer maybe the latter part first. I think there's been a push for modular housing, for example, like with government funding, et cetera. And I think with every one of these initiatives, there are obstacles. And I think it is because we're very highly regulated environment, both from kind of zoning and building code perspective. So, even to make the modular housing kind of really more affordable in a meaningful way also means changing some of the legislation and the way the Ontario Building Code kind of operates when you inspect things. And so there's, I think there's innovation in the industry, but the kind of legislation has to kind of follow to really see the advantages of that. I think promoting the kind of lower rise multi-units that can be built in wood is going to contribute to kind of lowering costs. I think if we see that, especially as kind of a more common method of construction, it's meaningful where it's not like a standalone unique project, and we can see the industry shift in that way. And on the zoning side, I mean, I don't remember the exact question, but like, I think absolutely we need to look at even if we look at what the provincial government is estimating and kind of set as targets for density, our zoning is like completely not in line with that. And it's at every scale from a single family home, like, you cannot build as of right anything. I'm talking about like Toronto as an example. So I think there needs to be a dramatic shift there.
Maybe Neeraj, just curious, would you say that the zoning challenges are similar in San Francisco?
Well, actually, I think because there's so much grassroots NIMBYism, across California in different ways, a lot of the rezoning questions are coming from a state level where, so for instance, what I just described is eliminating single family zoning and making sure any single family zone lot has the potential to have 2 extra units on it. It's coming from the state level. There was an ADU legislation 2 years ago, again, statewide. And in that legislation, no local jurisdiction could override, what the state level did. And so this was a way of, in some ways, kind of superseding things. And there's another zoning legislation of saying no planning department in the state can downzone any site right now. And if they do downzone like a neighborhood, they need to upzone another neighborhood to make up for it. So I think there's, it's kind of interesting to see where power resides. And in our case, coming from the state is able to kind of overcome some of the NIMBYism issues. I will say, one of the things in this question about, say, the precast, or when I think I think there's so much kind of put on, can we bring down the cost of construction? Can we bring the material cost down? And I think this fundamentally misses the point. I don't think the cost of housing, like even if those costs come down by 20%, that 20% eventually, when it's put into the system in a few years and goes through a few cycles, is not going to be given back to the user at all. It's going to probably go back to the bank or the developer or someone else. So I think these are very short-term kind of band-aid solutions in the end. I think the kind of system fundamentally is flawed of where kind of capital is being taken out of the system itself. And I think that, and I say this because I think there's a lot of pressure on us as architects and designers to find these solutions to make these kind of costs kind of squeeze and squeeze and squeeze. And they're very short-term fixes, in the end. And so I think this is why it needs probably a more systemic, maybe even a larger scale approach.
I think they also produce worse quality housing often, not in all cases, obviously, but the drive to make construction cheaper can do that. I think also the question of supply, one of the key issues with supply is that if you increase supply, you increase the cost of construction in all aspects of it, from labor to material costs to land costs. And so because as you increase supply, you make it more expensive to make housing. And as a result, it's hard to bring the price down. That's one of the reasons that it takes so many units to make a difference. So I think it is interesting to experiment with like the missing middle and, thinking about new areas that could really change significantly the quantity of supply, but it's not the magic bullet that's going to solve the problem. And I think that's where, Neeraj, your point about reparations, or really understanding how unequal the housing system is one way to provoke a human rights approach to housing, actually implementing policies which are stronger and which create more equitable solutions to housing.
Thank you all. Clearly, we could go on for many more hours, and I didn't manage to ask all the questions, but thank you, all three of you, for participating. I think it was a really fascinating discussion, and I know that this is sort of at the heart of each of your research and practice. So hopefully the conversations will continue directly and indirectly far beyond this. Just to let the audience know that the next session of the Alumni Speaker Series will take place in April. We invite you to complete the feedback survey that will be available when today's session ends, to let us know of topics that you'd like to hear about in the future. And in the next few days, anyone who registered will receive an email link to today's session to watch the recorded version of it on YouTube. So thank you all. Thank you all to the participants, people who asked questions, the audience, and yeah, enjoy the afternoon. Thank you again to the speakers.
Thanks, Lola.
Thanks, Lola. Nice to see you, Neeraj and Liana.
Good to see you all.